Good evening and welcome to WorldView Exposed. I'm Rachel Maddow, and tonight we are standing at the edge of what could have been one of the most consequential military decisions in modern American history. A decision that was made, weighed in the deepest corridors of power, and then at the very last moment pulled back from the brink. Tonight we are going to take you inside the story that the world is watching with held breath, clenched fists, and profound uncertainty. Because what happened, or more precisely, what did not happen between the United States and Iran in recent days, may have altered the trajectory of global geopolitics in ways we are only beginning to understand. Let me be direct with you right from the start. President Donald Trump, according to multiple senior officials and intelligence sources with direct knowledge of the deliberations, had approved and then postponed planned United States military strikes against Iranian power infrastructure, including critical electrical generation facilities and power grid networks that keep an entire nation of nearly 90 million people functioning. This was not a diplomatic warning. This was not a rhetorical threat issued at a press conference. This was an operational military plan that reached the threshold of execution. And then it stopped. The question that every analyst, every diplomat, every intelligence professional, and frankly, every ordinary person watching this broadcast should be asking is why? And perhaps more urgently, for how long? To understand the full weight of what we are reporting tonight, you have to understand where we are in the long, deeply complicated, and often explosive relationship between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is not a story that began last week. It did not begin with this administration or the one before it, or even the one before that. This beta space, this capability dramatically complicate the relationship, this perpescent and this kinds from first simple. The hostility between Washington and Tehran stretches back to 1979, to the Iranian Revolution, the hostage crisis, decades of sanctions, proxy wars, assassinations, nuclear standoffs, and repeated cycles of escalation and de-escalation that have defined the most dangerous fault line in the Middle East. Every American president since Jimmy Carter has had to navigate this relationship. Every single one of them has faced the same impossible tension. How do you exert maximum pressure on a regime without igniting a regional war that could consume allies, destabilize oil markets, and pull the world into a conflict it cannot afford? Donald Trump, in his first term, chose the path of maximum pressure. He withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018, over the fierce objections of European allies and against the advice of many within his own national security establishment. He reimposed devastating sanctions. He ordered the targeted assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's elite Quds force, in January of 2020, an act that brought the two countries closer to open war than they had been in decades. Iran retaliated with ballistic missile strikes against American military bases in Iraq. The world held its breath. And then somehow war did not come. Now, in his second term, Trump faces a version of the same crossroads, but the stakes feel even higher. The players have shifted, and the geopolitical landscape has changed in ways that make the calculations far more dangerous and far more complex. Iran has continued advancing its nuclear program. International inspectors have been restricted. Enrichment levels have climbed to near weapons-grade concentrations, and Western intelligence agencies have assessed with growing alarm that Tehran may be months, not years, away from possessing the materials needed to construct a nuclear device. That assessment alone, that terrifying clock ticking in the background, is what drove the conversations inside the White House and the Pentagon that we are reporting on tonight. According to officials familiar with the internal deliberations, the discussion was not simply whether to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. That conversation, as dangerous as it is, has been had many times before. What made this moment different, what made this particular briefing so grave and so significant, was the expansion of the target list to include Iranian power infrastructure, electrical power plants, grid switching stations, transmission networks. The kind of targets that, if destroyed, would not merely degrade Iran's military capability. They would plunge tens of millions of Iranian civilians into darkness, cut off hospitals, collapse water treatment systems, and trigger a humanitarian catastrophe that would echo around the world and inflame anti-American sentiment across every Muslim majority nation on earth. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it matters. It matters not only as a military or diplomatic question, but as a deeply human one. Somewhere in Tehran right now, there is a family, a mother trying to keep her children warm, a diabetic grandfather whose insulin must stay refrigerated, a young doctor in an understaffed hospital who needs functioning equipment to save the patient in front of them. The decision to strike civilian power infrastructure is not an abstract policy debate. It has consequences that fall hardest on the most vulnerable. And the men and women inside the United States government who debated this plan, whatever their ultimate conclusion, were not debating a map. They were debating human lives. So why did Trump postpone? Why, after a plan was reportedly approved and operational preparations were reportedly underway, did the order not come? Here is where the reporting becomes both illuminating and sobering. Multiple sources indicate that the decision to pause was driven by a confluence of pressures, some strategic, some diplomatic, and some deeply political. On the strategic side, senior military commanders reportedly raised serious concerns about second and third order consequences. Iran's military doctrine, in the event of an existential strike on its territory, calls for immediate and simultaneous retaliation across multiple theaters. That means Hezbollah activating from Lebanon against Israel. That means Houthi forces in Yemen escalating attacks on Red Sea shipping. That means Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria targeting American troops. That means the possibility of Iranian naval provocations in the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. The military told the president, according to those familiar with the briefings, that a strike on Iranian power infrastructure could trigger a regional war within 72 hours. On the diplomatic side, allies were alarmed. European partners, particularly the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, had been quietly but urgently communicating to Washington their deep opposition to any strike on civilian infrastructure. These are nations bound by international humanitarian law, nations that have populations deeply skeptical of American military action in the Middle East after 2 decades of post-September 11th wars. A strike on Iranian power plants would have shattered NATO solidarity on Iran policy at a moment when the Western alliance is already strained by disagreements over Ukraine, trade, and burden sharing. The diplomatic fallout, allies warned, could be irreparable. And then there was the back channel, because here is something the mainstream conversation often misses. Even amid the most severe public hostility, the United States and Iran have maintained indirect lines of communication through intermediaries in Oman, Qatar, and Switzerland for years. Those channels, according to intelligence community assessments reviewed by multiple outlets, were active in the days before the reported strikes were postponed. What was said through those channels remains unclear. But the timing, the abrupt pause in a plan that appeared to be moving forward, suggests that something moved in the diplomatic space. Whether it was a signal of willingness to negotiate, a warning of Iranian counter-escalation capabilities, or something else entirely, the world does not yet know. But the pause happened, and the pause matters. Now, you might be asking, and you should be asking, what happens next? Is this simply a delay? Is it a permanent stand down? Is it a negotiating tactic? And the honest answer, the one that any credible journalist must give you, is this: we do not know. What we know is that the underlying conditions that produced this crisis have not changed. Iran's nuclear program continues, the sanctions remain crippling, the regime in Tehran faces enormous domestic pressure with an economy under severe strain and a population that has endured years of hardship. And the Trump administration has made no secret of its determination to prevent Iran from achieving a nuclear weapon by any means necessary. What that phrase, any means necessary, actually means in operational terms is the question that keeps intelligence analysts and foreign policy experts awake at night. Because there is a vast spectrum of options between a strongly worded statement and a military strike. There are cyber operations, there are covert actions, there are tightened sanctions. There are coordinated international pressure campaigns. There are, and this is the path that many career diplomats and former national security officials are urgently advocating, serious, direct negotiations that address both Iran's security concerns and the world's legitimate alarm about its nuclear ambitions. The international reaction to the reported postponement has itself been telling. In Israel, government officials expressed both relief and anxiety. Relief that an immediate escalation was avoided, but anxiety that a delay may simply embolden Iran to push further toward nuclear capability while the window for effective military action narrows. Prime Minister Netanyahu's government has long maintained that a nuclear-armed Iran represents an existential threat to the Israeli state. And Israeli officials have made clear in both public and private forums that they retain the right to act independently if they believe the threat is imminent. The possibility of unilateral Israeli military action with or without American coordination is not hypothetical. It is a contingency that American military planners must factor into every calculation they make about this crisis. In Moscow and Beijing, the response was characteristically different. Russian state media framed the postponement as evidence of American hesitation and weakness, a narrative that serves the Kremlin's broader effort to portray the United States as an unreliable and erratic actor on the world stage. China, which has developed significant economic ties with Iran despite Western sanctions, and which depends on Middle Eastern energy supplies, quietly expressed support for diplomatic resolution, while making clear that any military conflict threatening regional stability would be viewed with grave concern in Beijing. The great power competition that defines this era of global politics casts its shadow over every decision Washington makes about Iran. And what about the Iranian people themselves? What about the 90 million human beings who live inside that country, who are not their government, who did not choose their leadership in the way that citizens of democratic states choose theirs, and who would bear the most immediate and devastating consequences of any military strike on their nation's infrastructure? Voices within Iran's civil society speaking at enormous personal risk have consistently called for international engagement and against military confrontation. They know, perhaps better than anyone, that a war does not weaken authoritarian regimes. It almost always strengthens them. It gives them an enemy to point to. It silences dissent in the name of national survival. The Iranian opposition, the students who have taken to the streets at the cost of their freedom and sometimes their lives, the women who have defied the morality police with breathtaking courage, these are people who would not be liberated by bombs falling on their power grid. They would be pushed further into darkness in every possible sense of that word. This is the moral weight that sits at the center of this story. And I think it is important, I think it is essential that we hold that weight in view, even as we report on the strategic maneuvering, the intelligence assessments, the military planning, and the diplomatic back and forth. Because foreign policy is ultimately about people. It is about what kind of world we are building or failing to build. And the decisions being made right now in the Situation Room, in the halls of the United Nations, in the ancient cities of Tehran and Jerusalem and Riyadh, will shape the lives of millions of people who will never be invited to the table where those decisions are made. What we at WorldView Exposed can tell you with confidence is this. The fact that strikes were postponed is not a resolution, it is a pause. The nuclear clock continues to tick. The sanctions continue to bite. The regional tensions continue to simmer, and the Trump administration has given no indication that it has abandoned the option of military force. In fact, officials close to the White House have made a point of emphasizing publicly and deliberately that all options remain on the table. That is not accidental language. It is a message. It is aimed at Tehran, at allies who may be growing weary of the pressure campaign, and at domestic political audiences who want to see strength and resolve from their commander-in-chief. The coming weeks and months will be critical. Watch for signals in the rhetoric coming out of both Washington and Tehran. Watch for movements in the diplomatic back channels for whether the Omani intermediaries or the Swiss diplomatic mission begin carrying more frequent messages. Watch for the International Atomic Energy Agency's reports on Iran's enrichment activities, because those technical assessments from Vienna are in many ways the most important documents in this crisis. And watch, because this matters more than perhaps anything else, for signs of whether dialogue is possible, whether there exists any formula through which the legitimate security concerns of all parties can be addressed without this situation ending in catastrophe. History tells us that crises like this one can go two ways. They can escalate sometimes slowly, sometimes with terrifying speed, into conflicts that consume nations and generations, or they can become the pressure point that finally produces a breakthrough, an agreement no one thought possible, forged in the fire of mutual necessity. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which brought the world closer to nuclear war than at any other moment in history, ultimately produced not Armageddon, but a back-channel agreement and the beginning of superpower arms control. The Iran nuclear deal of 2015, for all its flaws and limitations, was for a time proof that even deeply hostile states can find common ground when the alternative is unthinkable. We are not there yet. We may not get there. But we are also not past the point where that outcome remains possible. And holding on to that possibility while being absolutely clear-eyed about the dangers is the most honest thing a journalist can offer you tonight. This is Rachel Maddow, and you have been watching WorldView Exposed, the channel that brings you the stories behind the headlines, the context behind the crisis, and the truth behind the official statements. We will continue to follow every development in this story with the rigorous, independent, and fearless reporting that you deserve. Do not let the complexity of this moment push you toward indifference. Stay informed, stay engaged, because what happens between Washington and Tehran in the weeks ahead will not only determine the fate of a region, it will help define the world that all of us, every one of us, will be living in for decades to come. Stay with us. The story is far from over.